Aimed at creators, ASUS's ProArt PX13 has a lot to offer in a small package. It's got a beautiful 13-inch OLED display, a 12-core Ryzen AI CPU, and a dedicated NVIDIA RTX GPU. But for $1,700, I feel like I ought to be able to enjoy all of that while it drives me to work, am I right? Well, I guess we'll have to leave that to Elon if he ever decides to deliver on that promise. And while usually we see laptops at this price point prioritize gaming, this one's a little different. Today, I'm gonna touch on what exactly you're getting with this laptop and how it performs, and you can decide for yourself if it's all worth them claims. The PX13 comes with the newly released Ryzen AI 9 HX370, 32 gigabytes of memory, an RTX 4050 with 6 gigabytes of VRAM, and a 1 terabyte SSD. It's 3.04 pounds with its 73 watt-hour battery and substantial cooling under the hood, like Kyler in a hoodie while he's wearing his chains. The included 200-watt charger means that it can juice it up with its full 100-watt supported charge rate. Its matte black anodized aluminum chassis feels rugged and, at the very least, won't get covered in fingerprints. Looking at ports, we've got a micro SD card reader, a 10 gigabit USB Type-A port, and a 40 gigabit USB-C port on the right side. On the left, we've got an audio jack, another 40 gigabit USB-C port, an HDMI 2.1 port, and the charging port. There's Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.4 on board as well, which is always welcome. For the keyboard, it's a brightly lit chiclet style keyboard with a 1.7mm travel distance. It feels premium and uncompromising, as it's the size you would expect from larger laptops just without a numpad. The touchpad is actually interesting, as it's got ASUS's dial pad, which is this circular indentation that you can touch to make fine adjustments in creative software, scrub through media, or simply adjust the volume and brightness. It was a little frustrating to set up initially. There's a little button that you have to touch to activate the dial, which gets denoted by this light up piece in the middle, but you don't just press the activation button, you have to slide your finger away from it. You can then choose which applications can use it, and the controls it displays will correspond to whichever window is in focus currently. They have built-in dial profiles for Premiere, Photoshop, Spotify, CapCut, and even their weird AI bloatware, which we'll get back to later. The actual functions of the dial vary in their levels of usefulness. You can scrub through videos in Premiere, adjust brush sizes in Photoshop, and even bind your own macros. You're not given the most robust tool set to customize them, but it's still a neat addition regardless of all it really allows for is single keystrokes at a time. It's interesting, but the dial being baked into the touchpad makes it kinda too clunky for me to imagine relying on its functionality on a daily basis. If you really want to make it work yourself though, the functionality is there for you to make that happen. Then we've got a pretty standard webcam up top, but what's more interesting is what's below. Not that far, the screen. I'm talking about the screen. Here we've got a 13-inch 2880 by 1800 16 by 10 ASUS Lumina OLED display with a 1,000:1 contrast ratio, 0.2 millisecond response time, is VESA Display HDR True Black 500 certified, and covers 100% of the DCI-P3 color gamut. ASUS OLED Care is an included app with some options to help prevent burn-in, so you can rest easy if that's something you're worried about, which I know a lot of people are. It's also a touchscreen with Corning Gorilla Glass to provide resistance to scratches, and it's got full rotation hinges that only mildly resemble stacks of fresh out of the box staples that somebody spray painted black. And those allow you to use it like a tablet and even do some drawing, since it's also got stylus support. Unfortunately, it's only at 60 Hz refresh rate, which might be a bummer if you're looking for a laptop in this price range. It's not a deal breaker, but I have seen several complaints in reviews and comment sections about that refresh rate. ASUS sacrificed refresh rate for other features by going with this panel, which is understandable. I mean, let's not lose sight of the fact that we're looking at over 5 million pixels on a 13-inch OLED display. It's bonkers. We're going to focus now on what's under the hood by getting into some benchmarks. In previous videos, we've already gone pretty in depth with these Ryzen AI 300 chips, so we're able to compare it to the lesser AI 9 365 for some tests. For the majority of our tests, we're going to keep the PX13 plugged in and in its default power profile standard mode. In Cinebench 2024, we see it grab a score of 1145, a 40% higher score compared to its 10-core little brother. In Geekbench 6, we've grabbed a bunch of results from their public database to compare, and it fares nicely. It is easily competing with the most performant performant mobile chips out there with a multi-core score of 15,242 and a single-core score of 2,875. This time though, the HX370 is just 17% ahead of the 365 SKU. As for video production, we ran Puget Systems Puget Bench Premier Pro benchmark. The PX13 breaks 5,600 points, which is 44% above what we get with the integrated Radeon 890M enabled, and 80% faster than the 880M equipped ZenBook S16, in case you're curious. And if you're curious about gaming, then don't go anywhere, because that's where we're headed next. We're still sticking with the default power mode, plugged in to see how the PX13 fares out of the box. In 3D Mark TimeSpy, we're looking at an overall score of 8368, a graphics score of 8015, and a CPU score of 11,154. For games, we're including results at both the PX13's native resolution of 2880 by 1800, as well as 1080p. We'll note when we're using any upscaling, so you can assume we're at 100% resolution scale otherwise. We're starting off with Counter-Strike 2, where we can see that the 4050 is more than capable of handling that 3K display at the high preset with an average frame rate of 107. For you high refresh rate gamers, we've dropped the resolution to 1080p to see a respectable 146 FPS average, which might actually mean something here if only the dang thing wasn't stuck at 60 Hz. For GTA 5, we're again watching the PX13 make quick work of it, achieving 67 FPS on average at max settings with no MSAA or advanced graphics. GTA 5 is old, but if you crank them settings up, it is not so easy to run. Lowering the resolution to 1080p with the same settings pushes the frame rate above 120. With Baldur's Gate 3, we're pleasantly surprised as the full 1800p resolution with the Ultra preset, we get an average of 31 FPS. For a turn-based game like this, that's actually completely playable. Heck, that's better than Bloodborne ran on the PS4, and people ate that up. And the visuals are impressively sharp on this screen. Dropping to 1080p, still at Ultra, we're able to average over 50 FPS. You probably won't push much over 60 if you lower the settings, so I'd probably stick with Ultra or High. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, you're really gonna wanna use DLSS, as native 1800p with the minimum preset, we're averaging only 52 FPS. At 1080p with the same settings, that doubles to 105 FPS. Retesting with DLSS Ultra Performance at the Ultra Graphics preset nets us 85 FPS on average. It's a sad state, but the days of gaming at full resolution may be over. In Cyberpunk 2077, we're looking at 55 FPS at 1800p with the medium preset, and at 1080p medium, the PX13 climbs up to 85 FPS on average. We grab about the same FPS in 1800p at medium if we enable DLSS Ultra Performance mode. Borderlands 3 retains its usual stutter across all settings, but starting with 1800p on medium, we see a solid average of 68 FPS. Reducing the resolution to 1080p on medium nearly doubles our frame rate to 124 FPS. We also tested it at 1080p on Ultra, which delivered performance almost identical to 1800p on medium, averaging around 68 FPS. So gaming on this thing's pretty decent, which is nice, but again, not the primary focus of the device. You might assume that'd be for AI performance, instead based on the Ryzen AI9 HX370. And while there is AI stuff happening, it's a little weird. We've got an XDNA 2 NPU, which AMD says can put out 50 tops, which sounds cool, and running Geekbench ML, which sees the RTX 4050 flex its muscles and hit just shy of 11,000. Which you might think the whole point of an AI chip was to use the AI on the HX370, but the 4050 is just better at AI than the dedicated NPU. You can see that disabling the 4050 and instead using the 890M drops performance to just 64% that of the dedicated GPU. Opera recently released a benchmark to measure your device's readiness to run large language models locally. There are 3 indicators to the Opera benchmark reports: tokens per second, first token latency, and model load time. In the AI ready profile, the HX370 makes good use of the RTX 4050 to achieve 89 tokens per second, a first token latency of 39 milliseconds, and a model load time of 1.5 seconds. The benchmark also declares the system's preparedness at the top of the screen as AI functional, which is the highest rating. The benchmark's free to run from the Opera browser if you'd like to run it to see how your system compares, but this laptop also supports ASUS's stable diffusion-based AI image generator called MuseTree right out of the box. It's kind of a funky take on fine-tuning your picture where you can combine different balls, yes, that's what they call them, together to make new stuff or add stipulations to your keywords and prompts. It does all the AI computing locally, but what kills me is despite the thing's fancy new neural processing unit, The 4050 is still doing absolutely all of the heavy lifting there by default. You'd think it would be the new and improved NPU pulling the AI performance, but I guess we had to give that 4050 something to do since this laptop isn't really meant for gaming, even if it does game pretty decent. That being said, now let's look at thermal performance, which we're going to take a look at Cyberpunk 2077 since it pushes both the CPU and GPU. We captured hardware info statistics to see how power and thermal settle in, and while on battery, we see the GPU consuming 45 watts while the CPU sits at 15 watts. The hotspot temperature on the CPU was at about 67 degrees, while the GPU hotspot hovered around 74 degrees. For the last 15 minutes, the laptop was plugged in so we can see how power and thermals adjust. The GPU jumps to 65 watts while the CPU is nudged up to 20 watts. This cost us pretty big in terms of temperature, as the hottest point of the CPU reached almost 90 C and the GPU hotspot rose to almost 80 C. You can definitely hear the fans, but they're actually not too bad considering it's a 13-inch laptop. The ProArt PX13 pulls between 75 and 80 watts from the battery while playing Cyberpunk 2077 in the default standard mode, so that'll mean under an hour of playtime on a full charge if you don't rein in the power consumption by limiting the frame rate or switching over to the iGPU. In Whisper mode, also on battery, the fan speeds are reduced while TDPs remain the same. This resulted in the CPU hotspot temperature reaching 72 degrees and the GPU hotspot reaching 82 degrees. So on battery, temperatures are in check. It's really only when this thing's plugged in that it gets pretty toasty. In Cinebench 2024, we see the power budget shifts to the HX370 CPU cores as it's given 55 watts in the default standard mode while plugged in. The CPU hotspot reaches over 90 degrees as the load is sustained, but I also want to direct your attention to the VRM temperatures as I caught it reaching 98 degrees. Yowza. In performance mode, fan speeds are increased quite a bit and another 10 watts is thrown at the CPU. At 65 watts, we see the HX370 rides about 100 megahertz faster at similar temperatures. The VRM touches the upper 90s, much like standard mode as well. So while you're shelling out $1,700 for a laptop with a small footprint that packs a heavy punch, you're also paying the price in thermals in some cases. That's just something you have to keep in mind for any laptop, but especially so when you push 100 watts through such a small frame, as it's going to be hard to keep everything perfectly cool, according to the laws of thermodynamics. As for the surface temperature, we measured about 48 C near the middle of the keyboard and over 50 at the top of the keyboard while running Baldur's Gate 3. The fans are located below the keyboard underneath where your hands rest, pulling fresh air around your hands. This does a nice job at keeping heat away from your fingers, but your palms are still likely to get warm, as with many laptops. The bottom of the laptop also nears 50 degrees, so it's not so much going to be a laptop as more of a tabletop when you push it under a full load. It's a metal chassis, so you should expect the whole thing to heat up as it sheds all of that energy. For battery life, we're testing in standard mode. We mentioned earlier that the system will suck back 75 watts from the battery, which would of course lead to less than an hour of battery life for that 73 watt-hour battery. Stressing just the CPU with CPU-Z, we saw the power draw from the battery sit steady at just under 60 watts, which should allow for up to an hour and a half of 100% CPU load on a full battery. For YouTube playback, we saw it sit at 23 watts pulling from the battery, while web browsing pushes it closer to 30 watts as you load web pages and whatnot. For most general use in a web browser, you shouldn't expect more than 3 to 4 hours away from the wall unless you change the power settings. When we woke it up from sleep, power consumption only dropped as low as 9 watts, meaning you can't expect any crazy standby time. If you unplug it in the morning and turn it on, it'll probably be dead by the time you go to bed, even if you don't touch it. So it's not the king of battery life, but as we keep saying, there's trade-offs for this kind of compactness and performance. An RG Ally X, for example, has about the same size battery, but the entire device won't draw more than around 40 watts on battery. A laptop like this will sustain around 80 watts and won't idle super efficiently either. So if you're a creative professional looking for a sleek 13-inch Windows laptop to take your work on the go, ASUS does offer a quality package with solid performance. If you're an engineer, software developer, or artist, someone who might need performance like this, you're no longer forced to buy a flashy gaming laptop you feel reluctant to bring into the office. It's a surprising amount of performance coming from such a small package, with great I/O and plenty of memory to satisfy your needs. Though with it being such a small form factor, you'll likely want some external power source when traveling, unless you're on a pretty short flight. And hey, on that flight, you can even do some gaming and maybe even do whatever it is people like to do with AI right now. Just make sure you use the 4050 for the processing, not the AI chip. Plus, the screen is just beautiful. So anything you do from gaming to Photoshop or even just web browsing is going to look brilliant compared to any non-OLED display. And if you feel like you can make use of the ASUS dial pad and their included software with AI functions and whatnot, the PX13 might just be worth $1,700, but it is going on sale lately. It's a laptop built from the ground up for creatives, which can be hard for gamers to comprehend, but things like this do exist, and this is a pretty good example of it.